Hey everybody, this is chapter 5 of Christos Memos' Open Marxism Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment. The chapter 5 is titled A Critical Theory of Class, Labor and Economics. Critical Theory of Class, Labor and Economics. I exited out of the PDF as soon as I opened my mouth. That's embarrassing. Now let's listen to me embarrass myself some more. How about it, huh? For the kids. For open Marxism, subversive and negative critique is a, quote, truly human phenomenon, a, quote, instead of myth, end quote. As, quote, instead of myth, end quote. The myths of state and party politics are the invisible hand of the market. Quote, subversive and negative critique espouses critical reason, end quote. Bonafelt, 2006. This process of demythologization constituted part of open Marxism's radical contribution to the tradition of militant enlightenment and involved the critique and negation of any kind of abstractions and power they exert upon people's lives. It amounted to a critical theoretical and practical effort to liberate people from the compulsion of illusory primary economic, political, and ideological categories, forms, institutions, and apparatuses that have appeared as new mythologies and mystifications. They occurred as independent, separated powers, as fate that overtakes them, although they stemmed from their own activity, creation, and production. A key aspect of this critique is the refutation of positivistic and, quote, scientific pretensions which are found within the various strands of traditional Marxism, with the aim of developing the critique of political economy into a critical social theory of economic objectivity and a critical theory of abstract labor, class, and class struggle. Bonafelt succinctly encapsulates the objective of the critical theory of open Marxism, quote, the existence of class relations does not call for a Marxist class theory, nor does it call for an argument from the standpoint of the working class. It calls for a critique of class society and for a critique of the capitalistically organized form of labor. End quote. Bonafelt. The open Marxist critical theory of class does not aim at the glorification of qualities inherent in the tradition of the working class, nor does the open Marxist critical theory of class articulate its arguments from the standpoint of the working class. Rather, the open Marxist critical theory of class is a dialectical and critical approach from the standpoint of human emancipation that understands class as a critical, historical, and dynamic concept and a social relation. Open Marxism's critique of capitalist class society has as its objective the abolition of the class system and by extension the abolition of the proletariat. In 1958, in an important contribution to this critique, Kozik forcefully pointed out that what distinguishes Marxism from the sociological conceptions of class is that it constitutes a, quote, theory of the real process of the abolition of all classes, end quote. Kozik. Opposed to a sociological and definitional and classificatory conception of class, Kozik argues that class cannot be understood as a static finished result and an isolated and definable category. An anti-sociological understanding of class is based on the elaboration of a dialectical, genetic historical method which regards social classes as historically transitory phenomena. Kozik countered the approaches that considered classes as immutable entities and sought to subsume them logically and one by one to fixed definitions, locations, and structures. The concrete concepts of, quote, proletariat and, quote, bourgeoisie signify a, quote, dynamic unity of many determinations, end quote, and therefore they cannot be analyzed and theoretically grasped only in terms of their relationship to the means of production. The working class must be placed within a historically specific context and examined in the process of its confrontation with other classes and its relation with society as a whole, and through the exposure of internal contradictions. In his critical engagement with the positions of both Weber and Mills, Kozik noted that the, quote, distribution of wealth, the hierarchy of power, and the gradation of social status is determined by inherent regularities that ensue from the real structure of the social order at a specific stage of its development, end quote. Contrary to Weber, in Kozik's opinion, Marx considers that, quote, class is a concrete social totality with several aspects and determinations, end quote. A concrete historical, relational, and dynamic totality, quote, contains within itself all moments of social life, since the people who form classes are not mere abstractions, but rather are sets of political relationships in all spheres of the human essence, thus practical, intellectual, emotional, moral, and others, end quote. Kozik. Expressing views that resonated with E.P. Thompson's position, Kozik viewed society as an organic whole, thus arguing against the orthodox Marxist reduction of class analysis to economic simplification and vulgarization. Kozik contended that the Marxist analysis of class and the class-thinking approach in relation to the comprehension of social reality involves the, quote, reproduction of reality as a unity of economics, politics, and social and intellectual life as determined by the real socio-economic structure, end quote. What Kozik shares with other critical and open Marxists from Eastern Europe, and particularly with scholars from the Praxis group in Yugoslavia, is a similar critical stance towards all class societies, including both capitalism and the transitional societies in Eastern Europe, which continued to be class societies. All class societies are societies of unfreedom, alienation, and inhumanity. As Rubel noted, quote, the dictatorship of the party aimed to create, not abolish, a, quote, Soviet proletariat, and to establish social relations compatible with the exploitation of to establish social relations compatible with the exploitation of wage labor and the domination of man by man, end quote. Rubel. According to Petrovich, what is called a progressive class, or the idea that the working class should be the new ruling class that fights for a, quote, new, freer form of class society, end quote, in fact only constitutes a struggle for a, quote, new, quote, freer form of unfreedom, end quote. Petrovich. For open Marxism, then, the free and open socialist society the working class strives for makes sense when it does not involve the establishment of a new ruling class, nor does it imply the transformation of the vast majority of the people into a working class. The crucial issue at stake here is an ongoing struggle which is based on the postulate that, quote, the quote, radical champion of freedom can only be the class that fights for the abolishment of every class society, and of itself as a class, end quote. Petrovich. Open Marxism in Eastern Europe was engaged in a dual struggle. The struggle was primarily expressed as a critique of the attempt to preserve the, quote, mythological vision of an impoverished proletariat in the West, end quote. Stilyanovich. In the East, however, it was a critique of the party which decided on behalf of the working class that the working class was the ruling class without this ever being the case. In a series of substitutions, the party was replaced by the Central Committee, which in turn was substituted by the Politburo and the top leadership officials, which finally came to be substituted by the leader. The form of that sentence is very similar to the form of that Trotsky critiqued Lenin in 1904 in a piece, I believed. Maybe it was 1903, but I think it was 1904, in a piece titled Our Political Tasks. The working class was supposed to be the subject of all social development and the new ruling class which substantiated the progressive logic of history. In reality, it was the object of mystification, exploitation, and domination, a, quote, mere accessory, end quote, a, quote, false and inverted pseudo-subject, end quote. Kozik. As Stilyanovich underscored, the critical undertaking entailed a struggle against the, quote, ideological myth, that the proletariat was the ruling class in the Stalinist system, end quote. Stoyanovich. And against the pretensions of the ruling class in the Stalinist regimes, which, quote, modestly delegitimized itself as the representative of the class which it actually exploited, end quote. The emancipatory project of open Marxism can be understood as a critical theory of demystification, which has as its objective the revelation of the ideological pretension that the working class was the ruling class as mystification, a, quote, socially necessary illusion, end quote. This critical undertaking of demystification concerned not only the Eastern European class societies that were governed by a bureaucratic minority with the use of police methods, but also the West capitalist societies that are under the rule of money and capital. In capitalist social reality, the seemingly petrified relations and conditions of existence appear in mystified and fetishized forms, and therefore, quote, only a thoroughgoing theory of society can tell us what society really is, end quote. Adorno. In setting out to produce a critical, subversive, and thoroughgoing critique of society, and with the stated aim of providing a critical theory of class struggle, and labor, open Marxism attempted to abolish the naturalness and givenness of the reified social, economic, and political forms, and to, quote, uncover their common source, end quote. That is, to, quote, discover surplus value as the substance of all these historically phenomenal forms, end quote. Kozik. The Conference of Socialist Economists opened Marxism's critique of political economy focused on the origin and social constitution of economic forms. It aimed to decipher the real economic abstractions that dominate capitalist social reality in order to uncover the historically specific and definite social relations of production that manifest themselves as the compulsion and rule of economic forces. The fetishism of commodities amounts to a process according to which the capitalist social relations reveal themselves as being abstract economic forces, as mysterious economic abstractions and forms that rule the everyday lives of individuals. The, quote, new reading of Marx developed by Adorno and Horkheimer's students, namely Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Georg Backhaus, and Helmut Reichelt at the end of the 1960s, has made a valuable contribution to the task of unpacking the, quote, natural appearance of economic objectivity and revealing the ways in which social relations are inverted and reshaped into reified economic forms that assume a mantle of inevitability and necessity. However, according to Bonafelt, the, quote, new reading of Marx, end quote, does not, quote, explain the social character of economic objectivity, end quote. After all, quote, what is objectified, end quote. Bonafelt. The critical work of the, quote, new reading of Marx was incomplete because the work of the new reading of Marx did not seek to expound the, quote, fundamental categories, end quote, of, quote, class and labor, end quote. Elaborating on the critique of economic categories as a critical theory of social constitution, the CSE open Marxist approach, quote, substitutes the critique of the actual social relations for a logical development of the value form as some secularized thing that is valid in itself, end quote, and builds upon a, quote, critical theory of abstract labor, class, and class antagonism, end quote. Bonafelt. Open Marxist theorists developed the critique of political economy into a critical social theory of economic objectivity. Their critical analysis centered on the determining role of class struggle, as they saw that a purely logical exposition of economic categories dismisses the relationship between capital and labor and class antagonism from the critique of political economy, arguing against traditional Marxist theories, which proposed the notion of a, quote, Marxist economics, end quote. Holloway noted that they conceived of economic categories such as value, price, crisis, and so on, quote, as having an objective validity which does not depend on class struggle, end quote. Holloway. For the CSE open Marxism stream, the deciphering of the social basis of economic categories reveals that these relations are contradictory and antagonistic, and that, therefore, class struggle acts as a constitutive precondition of objectified economic forms. By addressing the issue of economic objectivity and economic objectivity's class character, open Marxism viewed class struggle as the content and the constitutive essence concealed within economic and political categories. Social individuals became invisible in the movement of economic quantities, and consequently class relations disappear in the exchange of economic things. Therefore, the notion of class cannot be adequately conceptualized by the basic level of appearances and levels of reliance upon revenue sources as a means of classifying people into various social classes. Marx's critique of the, quote, Trinity formula, end quote, capital, profit, land, rent, labor, wage, involves a break with the world of appearances and the conceptualization of class as a group of people or a structure. According to Clark, a class, quote, is not an interest group defined as a coalescence of individuals with a common interest, but is an inseparable part of a relation of production as such is analytically prior to the individuals who comprise it, end quote. Class relations are the, quote, logical and historical presupposition of capitalist production, end quote. Simon Clark. That is to say, a precondition of the specific relations of domination and exploitation that unfold between the capitalist and the worker in the realm of production. They are not just economic, they are also fundamental social relations that pervade every individual and, quote, institution of capitalist society for the simple reason that within a class society people enter social relations as members of particular social classes, end quote. As Adorno put it, we, quote, continue to live in a fundamentally divided society, end quote. A society marked by, quote, mutually hostile and conflicting interest, end quote. And more importantly, we, quote, live within a social system that precedes us and largely determines us in a variety of ways, end quote. Adorno. In his critique of Althusserian Marxism, Clark argued that class is not a, quote, thing, but a definite social production relation. The capitalist relation of production is not founded on the, quote, relation between laborer and owner of means of production, but on that between free labor and capital, and this is why it cannot be seen as an interpersonal relation, end quote. Clark. From this perspective, Rubel stressed that in this production relation, working class people are the, quote, modern slaves, end quote, and, quote, victims not of capitalists but of capital, end quote. Rubel. The capitalist relation of production, quote, is not fundamentally a property relation, but a relation between classes, end quote. Quote, is not fundamentally a property relation, but a relation between classes, end quote. And as Clark pointed out, quote, this relation is not defined by the legal connection of the members of these classes to the elements of the labor process, but by the modes of participation of the different classes in the total process of social production. Which includes not only production but also circulation, distribution, and consumption, end quote. Clark. Class relations between capital and labor acquire specific economic, ideological, and political forms which are, quote, historically developed forms of the relations of production, end quote. Simon Clark. They constitute a contradictory unity of diverse and specific forms of social relationships. As such, class relations, which are grounded in the extraction of surplus value occurring in the production process, quote, are not purely, quote, economic, but are, in class societies, multidimensional power relations which are expressed in particular ideological forms, end quote. Clark. The capital and labor class relation is a, quote, total social relation, end quote, and as such it, quote, cannot be reduced to the economic forms in which it appears. This is precisely the fetishism of the commodity that inverts the relationship between social relation and economic category, end quote. Clark. Or to any other particular form. Relations of exploitation and domination. As relations of exploitation and domination have appeared historically in various expressions of class societies, are not merely, quote, economic relations between particular individuals. They are class relations in which those individuals relate as members of social classes, end quote. Simon Clark. For open Marxism, then, class relations cannot be determined, defined, identified, and classified in economic terms alone. Capitalist class relations are social relations that manifest themselves in various political, ideological, and economic forms. From this standpoint, Clark held that Palancis's definition of classes is the, quote, result of an ensemble of structures and of their relations, end quote. Palancis was the result of Palancis's theorizing that classes are, quote, distributional categories, end quote. In other words, Palantis' theory of classes was not based on the capitalist relations of production. Rather, Palantis understood them as distributive classes which were constituted with reference to the technical functions and relations of different social groups as they are formed in the result of the distribution of the product and the source of their income. In his dissociation of class relations from relations of production, Palantis included the role of ideological and political factors in order to offer what Palantis thought was a Marxist theory of class, and which was seen by Clark as nothing more than a, quote, pluralist theory of social conflict, a conflict between distributively defined interest groups organized into pressure groups and political parties which seek to achieve their ends by organizing with state power as their objective, operating on a given and technically determined economic foundation, end quote. Simon Clark. In an influential article which was of key importance in establishing the framework within which Holloway's and Bonefeld's discussion of the concept of class would take place, Richard Gunn also argued against a traditional and reductionist view of class, and at the same time he countered the sociological conception of class, which could only lead to the pluralism of bourgeois sociology. Like Clark, Gunn based his analysis of the concept of class on the social character of production, which was not seen as a technical process but as a production of social relations. In other words, he saw class relations as the aggregate of social relations, which must be understood as production relations. According to Gunn, class is neither a group of individuals classified together according to their common socioeconomic trait, nor a, quote, place, that is a, quote, structure, in which individuals are located in relation to the fixed position they occupy within the social landscape. The terms, quote, class and, quote, class relation must be understood as undifferentiated, as class is always a, quote, class relation of some historically particular kind, end quote. Gunn. The antagonism between capital and labor is not merely an economic or functional and technical process, but a social and historical relationship. Within these social relations, the classes do not confront each other as pre-established entities and structurally predetermined categories. Class struggle defines and constitutes the formation of class in an active, dynamic, and unpredictable process. Developing his argument, Gunn maintained that class is a relation of struggle, and therefore, quote, class struggle is class itself, end quote. Gunn. Being an antagonistic struggle, class relation, that is, the capital-labor relation, does not seek to fit people into groups or pigeonholes. As a fluid relationship, it is independent of individuals, but also constructs individuals' lives as it subsists in and through them. In short, it permeates their lives. Haussmann has characteristically described the influence of this antagonistic class relation. Quote, a single class relation, capital labor, appears as a multitude of positions, including but not limited to capitalists and workers, managers, self-employed entrepreneurs, shop owners, retirees, housewives, prisoners, the disabled, and many more. All confront their social world and the problem of subsistence as different configurations of the capital-labor relation, but when this relation, quote, cuts through, end quote, them, rather than each inhabiting one side or the other, end quote. Haussmann. The capital-labor relation structures the, quote, lives of different individuals in different ways. It allows the line of class division to fall through and not merely between the individuals concerned, end quote. Richard Gunn, 1987. Running through individuals, it fragments individuals' lives, and as a result, their existence becomes contradictory. Class divides and fragments members of the working class whose, quote, feet remain mired in exploitation even while his or her head breathes in bourgeois ideological clouds, end quote. Their existence and perceptions about their own lives are ambivalent and contradictory. They live, quote, by making collages, end quote. Their, quote, individuality is a patchwork of collages, end quote. Castoriadis. In many different ways, Gunn's contribution offered a number of insightful and intriguing comments, but it failed to adequately set out the theoretical and political implications of this approach. What is of particular note is his attempt to argue against traditional Marxist class analyses, which viewed class as a, quote, object and conceptualized class and class struggle in a rather instrumentalist manner. From that perspective, by breaking with traditional and positivist interpretations of class as, quote, social groups, end quote, He offered a critical conception of class and class struggle, thereby opening up space for a more in-depth treatment of the subject informed by negative dialectics. Extending Gunn's perspective and building on Adorno's own critical theory, Bonafelt tried to offer a critique and not a theory of class. From the standpoint of critical theory, Bonafelt argued that, quote, class is not primarily a category of consciousness, it is a category of a perverse form of social objectification, end quote. As he succinctly put it, quote, Marx's critique of political economy does not derive the existence of classes from class consciousness. He analyzes the manner in which society organizes society's social reproduction, end quote. Bonafelt. For Bonafelt, social theory is critical when social theory makes sense of society from a starting point of recognizing society's social constitution, thus investigating society from within society's mode of subsistence and from the standpoint of struggle and contradiction. From this vantage point, Bonafelt has pointed out that, quote, class is not an affirmative category but a critical concept, end quote. Bonafelt. Capitalist society is fundamentally antagonistic and torn by contradictions. Adorno pointed out that society reproduces society's self because of society's contradictions and opposing interests. Mankind survives and, quote, preserves itself not despite all irrationalities and conflicts, but by virtue of them, end quote. Adorno. The antagonistic class relationship between the rulers and ruled, between capital and labor, reproduces the system and assists the system in extending the system's self, as, quote, society stays alive not despite society's antagonisms, but by means of society's antagonisms, end quote. Adorno. In this struggle between antagonistic forces, opposing individual acts as personifications of specific and definite class relations and class interests. In this process, to exist as a seller of labor power and to, quote, be a productive laborer is not an ontologically privileged position, end quote. Bonafelt. As Marx argued and Bonafelt frequently reminded us, quote, to be a productive worker is therefore not a piece of luck but a misfortune, end quote. Marx. As a negative and critical concept, then, class is part of a reified society and belongs to a perverted world of social relations, being a, quote, objective category of the false society, end quote. Bonafelt. If class is a negative category that belongs to the false society, equally then the working class cannot be construed as a, quote, ontologically privileged subject of history, end quote. Because if the opposite is the case, it means that we, quote, assign a positive status to a component part of a fetishized, antagonistic, and contradictory totality, end quote. Hausmann. CSE Open Marxism ascribes no historical inevitability or messianic mission to the working class and its role to radically transform capitalism. Class, and consequently the working class, is a negative category of a contradictory and false society in the sense that it cannot be defined as a static, fixed, and positive category, and because it subsists as part of a social conflict that contributes to the survival and perpetuation of the capitalist system. As Bonafelt indicated, quote, the critique of class society finds the positive only in the classless society, in communism, end quote. Bonafelt. The working class is a, quote, negative moment, end quote, to paraphrase Adorno's words, because within the working class, quote, is stored up not only all the negativity of the system, but also that which points beyond the system as it is now, end quote. I'm not sure who that quote is from. I don't know if that's Adorno or Bonafelt. The workers, according to Horkheimer, do not fulfill their, quote, world historical function by running machines, but by preparing themselves to replace the present form of society by a new form of society, and to concurrently negate and transform their own existence, end quote. From this perspective, quote, the concept, quote, proletariat, end quote, cannot be separated from this negative, this self-negating element, end quote. And this is one of the reasons that the, quote, social democratic and Russian glorification of the proletariat as, quote, the working human being, end quote, conflicts with Marx, end quote. Horkheimer. Open Marxism perceives capital as the product of two antagonistic poles of a social relationship that exists as a movement of contradiction. In this sense, the most fundamental and constituting contradiction of the capitalist mode of production is the class antagonism between capital and labor, and more specifically, the, quote, presence of labor within the concept of capital, end quote. Bonafelt. As Horkheimer astutely noted, quote, every specific contradiction in the course of development is a form of this same decisive contradiction, end quote. As part of the perverted appearance of social forms, class is experienced as a, quote, living contradiction. Contradictions cannot be classified, end quote. Bonafelt. Struggling in and through this contradiction, laborers share a common class experience, that is, their separation from the means of production and the compulsive selling of their labor power, which creates the conditions for solidarity and, quote, class unity and collective action, end quote. On the other hand, according to Adorno, one of the consequences of the quote, increasing bourgeoisification of the proletariat, end quote, is that the characteristic behavioral patterns which would otherwise apply within the dominant group in society, namely the behaviors of the competition, would also become increasingly common in the proletariat. The more bourgeois the workers felt in their own subjective consciousness, the more workers will view one another as competitors, end quote. Adorno. Economic compulsion marks the, quote, common class experience of labor market disunity. The economic compulsion marks the, quote, common class experience of labor market disunity, as each individual seller of labor power competes against the other for employment as the condition of gaining access to the means of life, end quote. Bonafelt. What appears to be a conflict of interest in the labor market and manifests itself in competition, according to Adorno, quote, is itself a dilute derivative of much deeper conflicts, those between classes, end quote. Adorno. Conflict of interest, the ruthless pursuit of self-interest, the search for money, gain, power, and authority occur, quote, after the central conflict over control of the means of production has already been decided, so that the competition is carried on within the sphere of an already appropriated surplus value, end quote. Adorno. Reflecting upon and engaging with the concept of class as a critical category, Adorno noted that, quote, in order to know what a worker is, one must know what capitalist society is. Conversely, capitalist society is surely no, quote, more elementary, end quote, than are the workers, end quote. Adorno. In critical theory, the concept of class is not understood as a pre-existing conceptual definition or prefix theoretical construct. Although class cannot be defined by the consciousness of a class's members, quote, subjective consciousness cannot simply be reduced to insignificance, end quote. Adorno. And in this respect, quote, if a worker no longer notices that he is a worker, this has important implications for theory, end quote. Adorno. If workers who live by selling their labor power prefer to ignore what they consider to be negative labeling, that is, if they do not accept or recognize that they are workers, then this, quote, affects the inherent composition of the concept of the worker, even if its objective definition, through separation from the means of production, is still fulfilled, end quote. Adorno. If the, quote, subjective class membership becomes all the more fluctuating, end quote, Adorno, and the issue of class consciousness bears no importance or is absent for long periods, then according to Adorno, quote, quantity turns into quality, and the suspicion of conceptual mythology can certainly be suppressed by decree, but not eliminated in thought, end quote. Adorno. For critical theory, the questioning of the, quote, conceptual mythology, end quote, of any kind, and in this instance, the, quote, conceptual mythology, end quote, regarding the issues of class and class consciousness is of vital importance. In keeping the concepts and categories open to the lived experience, human practice, and the class antagonism between capital and labor that is manifest in various expressions and forms. Although workers are less and less aware or willing to accept that they are such and less conscious of their objective position in the capitalist class society, quote, society remains class struggle, end quote. Adorno. A critical theory of class that claims to be a critique of capitalist society must not lose sight of the, quote, overall tendency of society to suck up the consciousness of the workers, end quote. Adorno. And of the fact that, quote, one must be careful not to ascribe once and for all some form of unchanging qualities to the workers. End quote. Adorno. Workers are members of the working class, and their struggles for subsistence constitute part of a negative and fetishized totality, and they survive and reproduce themselves because of these struggles. Their existence is contradictory as it is permeated by the capital-labor relation, which is internalized and manifested in various inconsistent, conflicting, and paradoxical forms and patterns of behavior. Although for open Marxism the working class and class struggle are perceived as negative categories of a false society that must be subjected to a negative and destructive social critique, their contradictory existence still bears elements of spontaneity and unpredictability. In this sense, the concept of the working class as part of the capital-labor relation and class antagonism rooted in the capitalist production relations maintains its openness and its contradictory historical movement, social dynamism, and uncertainty. The critical undertaking to radically change and transform global capitalist social relations through human practice, through class struggle and the activity of the working class, appears to be utopian and a self-illusory projection of wishful thinking on social development. Nevertheless, class struggle as a conceptualization of an open and class-divided social reality also contains the potential and the social dynamic to radically transform global capitalist society. Quote, not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively, class struggle remains inherently unpredictable and, quote, surprising, end quote. End quote. Richard Gunn. According to Holloway, class struggle and the power of labor are, quote, largely unseen, end quote. Marxism is not just a theory of the visible struggles of the social movement for human emancipation. It is also concerned with the, quote, power of the unseen, end quote. The everyday invisible struggles of workers, immigrants, women, and domestic servants who remain disguised and, quote, on whose successful exploitation the reproduction of society as class society depends. What is hidden is not just work, but exploitation, antagonism, negativity, end quote. Holloway. Quote, class struggle, end quote, as Gunn opined, quote, exists in the mode of being denied. Exists in the mode of being denied, end quote. Gunn. Holloway argued that, quote, we do not struggle as working class. We struggle against being working class, against being classified, end quote. Holloway. Viewing attempts to define the working class as subordinated to capital as part of the traditional, quote, understanding of the working class, Holloway considers class as process, as a dynamic concept. Following this line of thought, classes are not pre-constituted fixed static entities. Their existence cannot be separated from their constitution. Rather, classes are in a constant process of being constituted, as people are subjected to an endless process of classification and reclassification. This in turn means that class struggle, quote, is the struggle to classify and against being classified, end quote. Holloway. In this struggle, the working class battles against labor and against being working class in order to emancipate itself. In this respect, according to Holloway, the working class, quote, can be considered revolutionary only to the extent that it exists not only in but also against and beyond itself as working class, end quote. Holloway. Holloway surmises that class struggle is unfolding within capitalist society and at the same time is moving forward in a direction that leads beyond this society. The issue at stake, however, is which exact direction this, quote, beyond, end quote, is moving. This direction, unfolding and result of, quote, beyond, is definitely uncertain and open to all manner of potential prospects, dangers, and possible radical alternatives. Quote, not every crack or scream is necessarily progressive and emancipatory, end quote. Stutzler. In like vein, Axelos observed that Marx, quote, asserts and admits the reality and possibility of a catastrophe-laden resolution of class struggles. The mutual perishing of the two classes in conflict. The mutual perishing of the two classes in conflict, end quote. And noted that, quote, tragedy does not always lead to a progressive solution, end quote. Axelos. Quote, the class struggle for subsistence does not foretell the future. The class struggle for subsistence does, however, entail a profound judgment on the existing relations of social wealth, end quote. Bonafelt. Class antagonism is neither a positive category nor a social law of nature, as Marx noted in his critique of Ricardo. Footnote. As Marx wrote, quote, let us take England. Its political economy belongs to the period in which the class struggle is as yet undeveloped. Its last great representative, Ricardo, in the end, consciously makes the antagonism of class interests, of wages and profits, of profit and rent, the starting point of his investigations, naively taking this antagonism for a social law of nature, end quote. Marx. End footnote. The question of an alternative, free and open socialist society, and in general, the question of human emancipation, is not how to regulate and manage the class antagonism, but rather is a question how to end the class antagonism. Class struggle is rooted in the fundamental contradiction between capital and labor, but class struggle does not entail a collective self-organized struggle of those who live from the sale of their labor power to negate and change capitalist social relations in the direction of human emancipation and a classless society. Then it usually leads to a ruthless antagonism and search for atomized easy solutions and callous scapegoating. In the latter case, it could receive distorted and reified forms of antagonism and competition for self-preservation, money, a desire for power, domination, and distinction, and reaction against the class antagonism that not only reproduce the capitalist mode of production, but also make people relapse into new modes of barbarism. As Ignoli put it, quote, competition in no way leads to the abolition of the capitalist mode of production, but belongs rather to the capitalist mode of production's inner dynamic, end quote. Agnoli. Experiencing the competitive capitalist relations as a category of social disunity and recurring animosity and unfriendliness, the people who live from the selling of their labor power strive to maintain themselves by competing with other sellers of labor power, a competition which paves the way for nationalist, gender, and racial divisions and discriminations within the working class. Within this lived experience of capitalist coldness, uncertainty, and permanent anxiety, the quote, term cutthroat competition is experienced in various forms, from Marx an attack to class solidarity, from destitution to collective bargaining, from strike breaking to collective action, end quote. Bonafelt. Quote, human sensuous practice subsists through its supersensible existence in the autonomization of society as both the object and subject of its perverted social practice. As such, according to, end quote, according to Reichelt, quote, its class practice ensues thus through perverted social forms as well as in these perverted social forms and against these perverted social forms, end quote. Helmut Reichelt. This contradictory essence of class practice also means that, quote, class is not an affirmative category, but rather a critical concept of Marx's conception of reality, end quote. Reichelt. Adorno provided some valuable insight into this subject in his letter to Benjamin in 1936, when Adorno pointed out that, quote, the proletariat is itself a product of bourgeois society, end quote. Adorno. Adorno acknowledged that modes of behavior, political attitudes, delusions, stereotypical thinking, personal goals and desires, life plans, lifestyle and content of consciousness of working class people are markedly mediated and socially constituted because, among other things, they have been substantially permeated by and enmeshed in the dominant ideology and what he termed the, quote, culture industry, end quote. Against this criterion, Adorno considered that it is uncritical and an aspect of traditional theory to resort to generalizations based on the subjective dispositions, attitudes, and behavior of individual people. Nevertheless, Adorno's key claim was that there was a, quote, progressive disappearance of differences in the mode of consciousness, end quote, between the upper and lower strata, and by extension, the, quote, actual consciousness of actual workers, has absolutely no advantage over the bourgeois except, interest in the revolution, but otherwise bears all the marks of mutilation of the typical bourgeois character, end quote. Adorno. Whether the working class expresses an interest in the revolution and the struggle for human emancipation, or whether the working class reproduces all the capitalist forms of repression, domination, and barbarism in its own everyday struggle to make a living is a, quote, matter of experienced history, end quote. Bonafelt. Personal and collective involvement, lessons from the class struggle, lived or reified experiences, morality, political education, and maturity. Standing firmly on the side of human emancipation and the revolutionary transformation of capitalist social relations does not mean adapting, quote, to the weaknesses of the oppressed, quote, to the weakness of the oppressed, end quote, as this entails, quote, affirming in it the precondition of power, end quote, because the, quote, glorification of splendid underdogs is nothing other than glorification of the splendid system that makes them so. That is so good. What is of vital importance, however, is that, quote, we maintain our solidarity with the proletariat, end quote, especially when an interest in the revolutionary transformation of capitalist social relations is expressed, quote, instead of making our own necessity a virtue of the proletariat. So, quote, instead of making of our own necessity a virtue of the proletariat, end quote. Adorno. Some good shit. So I have to copy that down. Sorry, 1 second. Back to the text. Class struggle constitutes part of the rationalized irrationality of the capitalist reality, as long as it continues to feature within the framework established by the, quote, Trinity formula, principally speaking merely to ameliorate exploitation within the labor process. This struggle can be viewed as one that operates inside the perimeters of the perverted capitalist social reality, from where it satisfies itself with demands for a, quote, just wage and trade union recognition. Such struggles implicitly accept the reality and structures of capitalist society and assist in continuing reproduction of the, quote, cold inhumanity of free wage labor, end quote. Adorno, driving society into a situation of, quote, permanent transition or unchanging change, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the wage relation itself is a bourgeois and mystifying form, end quote. Richard Gunn. and the integrated class struggles that just aim to improve the wage relation and perform a reproductive and stabilizing function within capitalism, and in that sense, as Adorno put it, quote, all history is the history of class struggle, because it was always the same thing, namely prehistory, end quote. Adorno. As Marx emphatically pointed out in his address to the Central Committee of the Communist League, quote, for us the issue cannot be the smoothing over of class antagonisms, but the abolition of classes, not the improvement of existing society, but the founding of a new society, end quote. Marx, cited in Rebel, 1981. From this point of view, then, open Marxism's postulate is that, quote, the critique of class society finds its positive resolution only in the classless society, not in a, quote, fairer class society, end quote. Bonafelt. An issue, then, for open Marxism is how to end the prehistory of class struggle and how to present communism as a movement constructed from a synthesis of previous political and critical experiences and struggles, which fights for a society without class antagonism, for a classless society of the free and equal, rather than for a rationally organized socialist economy of labor. Following the critical tradition associated with the work of Marx, Horkheimer, Adorno, and Pistone, Bonafelt's critical theory involved a critique of the capitalistically organized form of labor, in opposition to the traditional reading of Marx's thought as an attempt to develop a socialist political economy. For Bonafelt, Marx's project was concerned with the critique of political economy. In the same vein, Rebel categorically asserted that, quote, the real target behind Marx's criticism of the science of political economy was the specific mode of existence, the mode of life and labor of humanity threatened by its own achievements, its technical inventions and institutions, end quote. Bonafelt. No. Who's that? Rebel. The effort to develop the critique of political economy as critical social theory entailed a critical rather than affirmative stance towards the concept of labor and the capitalist economic categories. Within the tradition of institutional Marxism, the concept of labor was used as a positive and ahistorical concept. It was set at the center of the so-called socialist ethical thinking and was incorporated within the value system and dignity of the, quote, new socialist man, end quote. The new ontology of labor constituted part of the very essence of the Stalinist regimes and served both as a means of social control and a form of punishment, as the danger of being sent to do factory and manual work was a permanent threat for all those citizens who bore unorthodox views or were critical of the regime, the party, the bureaucrats, and the leaders. To a certain extent and akin to capitalist and Protestant perceptions about work and workers' ethic. This is part of a new idealization of industrialism, the development of the productive forces, and the construction of a, quote, new type, end quote, of worker, and a new ethical and social significance ascribed to the concept of labor. Lenin's declaration in the State and Revolution that, quote, the whole of society will have become a single office and a single factory with equality of labor and equality of pay, end quote, Lenin, seems to have had both a direct and lasting subterranean impact on Lenin's disciples. It also constituted part of the ideology of the new ruling class of the Soviet regime. Lenin's epigons, especially Trotsky and Stalin, pushed this logic to its most extreme manifestations and consequences. Similar to, and at the same time different from the most advanced capitalist countries, in the Stalinist regimes, as Stoyanovich noted, quote, work was done not under only economic pressure, but under strong non-economic pressure as well, end quote. Stoyanovich. The orthodox Marxist new ontology of labor pushed the naturalization of labor to the naturalization of labor's extreme by reducing the essence of man to man's labor activity. Akin to capitalist ethics, the essence, mission, and destiny of man was identified with that of the economic man. According to this conception, man was seen as an economic animal, and human practice was identified with labor activity. Trotsky extended Lenin's idea of, quote, factory schooling, end quote, to Lenin's idea of, quote, factory schooling to its extreme limits when he stated that, quote, the only way to attract the labor power necessary for our economic problems is to introduce compulsory labor service. Compulsory labor service, end quote. Speaking the language of the new ruling class, Trotsky's repulsive and abhorrent account considered the idea of, quote, compulsory labor service, end quote, as an unquestionable and essential component of the new communist ethics, and he added cynically, quote, he who works not, neither shall he eat, end quote, Trotsky. And all must eat, all are obliged to work, end quote, Trotsky. In this sense, Trotsky not only called for the statification of all working class organizations and trade unions and their total subordination to the Soviet state, he also advocated the militarization of work and state control over labor power, and in order to back up his arguments and support his recommended policies, Trotsky did not hesitate to maintain the view that compulsory labor is always unproductive, quote, is the most pitiable and worthless liberal prejudice, end quote. According to Trotsky's theorizing, quote, even the serf organization was in certain conditions a step forward and led to the increase in the productivity of labor, end quote. Trotsky. On this basis, and since, quote, compulsory labor service, end quote, could be efficient, useful, indispensable, and much required by the new regime, Trotsky declared that, quote, the labor state considers itself empowered to send every worker to the place where his work is necessary, end quote. Trotsky. As, quote, the worker does not merely bargain with the Soviet state. No, the worker is subordinated to the Soviet state under the Soviet state's orders in every direction, for it is the worker's state, end quote. Trotsky. Stalin, as Lenin's successor, normalized and expanded these rather aberrant ideas by consolidating force, constraint, and obligatory labor as fundamental methods of socialist work, and as progressive and acceptable phenomena when they are set under the service of the Soviet state and for the cause of socialism. Stalin added to this notion of, quote, factory schooling, end quote, a work ethic known as, quote, Stakhanovism, end quote, and consequently, as Horkheimer underscored, quote, factory regimentation was extended to the entire society, end quote. Horkheimer. As a central feature of the state propaganda and the endeavor to create a new type of socialist citizen and worker, Stakhanovism was developed as part of the state ideology and made to appear as an eternal element of socialist production relations and work ethic. Endorsement of Taylorism, scientific management, the primacy of the economic and the development of the productive forces, industrialization, quantification, central planning that treated workers as living resources for the rationalization of production and economic progress, and the Stakhanovite system of ideas and values about work and workers were combined with orthodox Marxism's affirmative stance towards labor. In many instances, in pursuing Lenin's, quote, factory schooling, and, quote, further, this positivization and naturalization of the concept of labor resulted in the concept of labor being converted from a social right in capitalism to coercion and compulsion in the Stalinist regimes. Rousseau's, quote, force to be free, end quote, was transformed into, quote, force to be employed, end quote. In this rather monstrous synthesis of Lenin's idea of socialism and unfreedom, you were forced to be a worker, but you did not have the right to go out on strike. Orthodox Marxism and the traditional left espoused and advanced a conformist and, quote, corrupt conception of labor, end quote. They were under the illusion that the, quote, factory work, ostensibly furthering technological progress, constituted a political achievement, end quote. Consequently, according to Benjamin, quote, the old Protestant work ethic was resurrected among German workers in secularized form, end quote. Benjamin. This distorted conception of labor led to a positivization of the idea of, quote, work as a vocation, end quote, and to an eclipse of the past socialist, quote, critique of work as drudgery, end quote. In this way, as Horkheimer remarked, quote, work was transformed from the bourgeois badge of merit into the longing of the disinherited, end quote. The uncritical and transhistorical conceptualization of work as a source of wealth in capitalism led to the identification of factory work and industrial expansion with socialism and was coupled with an affirmative stance towards progress, dominance over nature, and the advance of technology, if the development of the productive forces and technological advance are left unquestioned and equated with progress, and, quote, if the bosses are progressive on the condition that they build factories, end quote, then, as Castoriadis wondered, quote, how could the commissars who built just as many and even more of them not be so as well, end quote. Castoriadis. However, technical progress does not necessarily entail social progress, and the orthodox Marxist conception of labor's, quote, the orthodox Marxist conception of labor, quote, scarcely considers the question of how its products could ever benefit the workers when they are beyond the means of these workers, end quote. The vulgar Marxist conception of the nature of labor implied a conformist ideology of work, and the cult of industry and technical progress recognized, quote, only the progress in mastering nature, not the retrogression of society, end quote. And by doing so, they displayed the, quote, technocratic features that later emerge in fascism, end quote. Benjamin. According to Adorno's critical point that, quote, the slave morality is indeed bad, it is still the master morality, end quote. And in contradistinction to Trotsky and traditional socialists who remained captive to the, quote, reactionary morality of the ruling class, end quote, Horkheimer noted that the issue at stake for critical theory and emancipatory politics, quote, is not the sanctification of work, but the struggle against work's present form, end quote. Horkheimer. In an attempt to reinforce this point, Horkheimer wrote, quote, whoever doesn't want to work shouldn't eat. This biblical pronouncement is a popular maxim. This maxim, whoever doesn't want to work shouldn't eat, should say, everyone should eat and work as little as possible, but even this is much too general. To make work the most important human activity is an ascetic ideology. How harmonious society looks when everyone, quote, works, irrespective of differences in rank and wealth. Because the socialists retain this general concept, they become the instruments of capitalist propaganda, end quote. Horkheimer. That's a good one. So I had to cut that down. The critique of capitalist social relations from the standpoint of a transhistorical, unitary, and normative conception of labor, when it is articulated especially for the sake of a, quote, unitary worker state, end quote, or in the name of abstract justice and equality and the universality of human rights demanding, quote, work for all, end quote, does not result in the creation of an alternative and qualitatively different society. A transhistorical concept of labor that is used with the ultimate aim of constructing a harmonious and socialist labor economy amounts to a positive critique of labor that acts within the rationale, conceptual principles, morality, economic categories, and the structures of the capitalist mode of production. This is the traditional leftist approach that either seeks to transform the, quote, capitalist labor economy into a social factory, end quote, Leninism, or has a plan to rationally organize the natural necessity of labor, quote, for the sake of a capitalism that works for the workers, end quote, social democracy, a welfare capitalism that serves the interests of the many over the few. The leftist normative conception of labor responsibly and constructively criticizes, quote, what exists on the basis of what also exists, end quote, and points not to the socialist transformation of the capitalist production relations, but to, quote, another variation of the existent capitalist social formation, end quote. Therefore, it is not a negative and subversive critique of bourgeois society, but rather a, quote, bourgeois critique of society, end quote. Pistone. The traditional Marxist framework, including Lukash's theorizing, deployed a, quote, transhistorical and commonsensical understanding of labor, end quote. And hence it was envisaged that human emancipation and an alternative socialist society would take, quote, a social form where transhistorical, quote, labor, end quote, freed from the fetters of the market and private property, bracket, would emerge, in bracket, openly as the regulating principle of society, end quote. Pastone. Labor was treated as a natural quality and the transhistorical foundation of all existent and pre-existing social formations, and the specificity of labor in capitalism was overlooked. Consequently, socialism was understood as a society in which unfulfilled potential would be fully developed and the unrealized essence of capitalist society substantiated. Accordingly, socialism would democratically realize the capitalist logic of labor through the implementation of central economic planning combined with expanded and more equal forms of distribution. Such an approach was part of the institutional Marxist viewpoint, according to which industrial production was not understood as a social relationship and activity, but perceived as a technical process, quote, intrinsically independent of capitalism, end quote. I don't know who that quote's from. This neutralized stance towards the idolization of industrialism resulted in the socialist vision being regarded as the, quote, transformation of the mode of distribution, not, however, of production itself, end quote. That sounds like Pastone. Hence, institutional Marxism, quote, as a theory of production, end quote, did not, quote, entail a critique of production, end quote. Pastone. That was definitely Pastone. However, as Castoriadis was quick to point out, quote, socialism is not a backyard of leisure attached to the industrial prison or transistors for the prisoners. It is the destruction of the industrial prison itself, end quote. Castoriadis. Breaking with the orthodox Marxist framework, socialism's objective requires a historically specific critique of capitalist social relations, which cannot be dissociated from the critique of labor. The critical undertaking of socialism then ought not to feature the idea of socialism through the affirmation and recognition of proletarian labor and industrial production. It should conceptualize socialism in terms of the, quote, possible abolition of the proletariat and of the organization of production based on proletarian labor, as well as of the dynamic system of abstract compulsions constituted by labor as socially mediating activity, end quote. Pastone. The persistent naturalization of social phenomena and categories in capitalist society is coupled with the seemingly ontological centrality of labor and economics to capital. In this social reality of reified social relations and, quote, existing untruth, end quote, a, quote, ghost-like society of economic compulsion, end quote, Bonefeld. Critical theory regards nothing as being independent of society and accepts nothing to posit itself as eternal, universal, and absolute. Nothing is considered to be ahistorical, that is, nothing to be hypothesized in advance of history or to be postulated as a predetermined telos of history. Rather, for dialectical reason, the, quote, absolute and the universal are formed in the course of history. The, quote, absolute and the universal are formed in the course of history, end quote. Kozik. What appears as natural, universal, immutable, and transhistorical subsists as the dialectical unity of the universal and the specific, to wit, quote, it exists at once as the universal condition of every historical phase and as its specific product, end quote. The recurrent key role played by labor and economics in capitalist society requires a fundamental critique that reveals their historically specific social constitution and demonstrates that, quote, the universally human is reproduced in every epoch as a particular outcome, as something specific, end quote. Quote, the universally human is reproduced in every epoch as a particular outcome, as something specific, end quote. What was problematic with the sociological, traditional, and uncritical approaches was that they tried to define, systematize, and describe work processes, routines, and activities, and therefore they neither addressed nor were able to answer the central question of, quote, what labor is, end quote. In other words, they failed to capture labor's historical specificity and social form that creates exchange value. In this sense, labor in capitalism produces a very, quote, specific historical form of wealth, end quote, and is not identical with the concept of, quote, labor in general, end quote, but is rather a, quote, particular labor, end quote, which has a twofold character, namely, it is the, quote, abstract concrete labor, end quote. Kozak. Bastone's contribution has been important and decisive in the development of the CSE open Marxist critique of labor and transhistorical conception of the labor economy. Despite all the various underlying theoretical differences and divergent emphases and perspectives of their analysis as they engage in critical dialogue with Bastone's position, they all stress the key importance of Marx's analysis of the double character of labor as a specific characteristic of capitalist production. Footnote. On this, see Bonafelt and Holloway. End footnote. The CSE open Marxists expounded Marx's critique of political economy by repudiating the ontologization of labor and by adamantly insisting on the twofold nature of capitalist labor. Those who adopted the most critical line in this approach considered the double character of capitalist labor and the relationship between concrete and abstract labor to be not just a, quote, contradictory opposition, end quote, but also a, quote, negative dialectical unity, end quote. Chris O'Kane, 2022. In doing so, they continued Marx's critique of political economy, which aimed to disclose the, quote, socio-historical content of the formal abstractions of political economy by revealing the socio-historical foundation of bourgeois property and alienated labor, end quote. Simon Clark. Developing the critique of abstract labor as a critical and fundamental element of the critique of political economy, and in line with Pastone, they argue that the critique of political economy amounts to a critique of capitalist social relations from the standpoint of labor as a transhistorical category, and they expanded this insight toward a critique of the double character of labor. Abstract labor is conceived as a, quote, socially valid form of concrete labor, end quote, Bonafelt, and as a social form of concrete labor is a, quote, specific capitalist form of labor, end quote, and a, quote, socially constituted real abstraction of socially necessary labor time, end quote, Bonafelt. As such, in capitalism, social labor is meant to produce exchange values, not satisfy social needs. It takes the form of an invisible labor, which under the prevailing conditions of socially necessary labor time, quote, determines whether the expended labor of the dissociated producers is socially valid, end quote. And in this sense, quote, abstract labor is the specifically capitalist mode of an association of dissociated producers, end quote. Bonafelt. As it is value producing in capitalism, labor cannot therefore be used and play a similar role in a supposedly centrally and fully planned socialist labor economy. This in turn means that, as Bonafelt argued in agreement with Holloway, the, quote, critique of abstract labor finds its positive resolution only in the abolition of abstract labor, end quote. Bonafelt. This open Marxist conception that develops the critique of political economy as a critique of labor has very significant theoretical and political implications. It rejects the idea of a free and open socialist society as a, quote, well-ordered republic of labor, end quote. Such a society, despite its proclaimed and rhetorical assertions, is in its, quote, entirety tied to capitalist relations, from the materiality of labor to the philosophy of progress, end quote. Bonafelt. In open Marxism, the focus on the critique of fetishism, the power of negative thinking, and the openness of categories to the significance and determining role of class struggle foregrounds the social basis of economic categories. By addressing the issue of economic objectivity, its social constitution and class character, open Marxism views class struggle as the constitutive essence concealed within economic categories. The critique of economics and economic categories reveals them as perverted forms of definite social relations and as historically formed and determined. For Clark, quote, The mystifications of political economy do not simply represent an ideological inversion of reality, but the ideological inversion of a real inversion. End quote. On these grounds, the open Marxist critique of the mystifications of political economy does not simply imply the critique of a, quote, ideological inversion of reality, end quote, or of a, quote, mystificatory ideology, end quote. It also denotes a critique of the, quote, alienated forms of social life which political economy describes but cannot explain, end quote. Simon Clark. Economics presumes economic phenomena, concepts, and categories as natural and eternal things that stand external to individuals and society. Economics identifies these economic things as, quote, both some quantifiable substance and an independent force of economic rationality, end quote. And yet it cannot, quote, tell us what the economic quantities are, end quote. Bonefeld. In the same vein, Kosick argues that, quote, economic categories do not tell what they are, but affect the life of society more like mysterious hieroglyphics, end quote. Kosick. For Kosick, economic categories are simultaneously social categories, end quote. Negative critique's objective is to decipher the social constitution of objectified economic forms, to show that economic categories such as money, profit, rent, wage, and capital are inverted social relations which simply appear to be independent, self-acting economic forces. The destruction of the pseudo-concrete character of the economic phenomena, that is, the abolition of their, quote, fictitious independence, end quote, unveils their, quote, mediatedness and counters their claim to autonomy with proving their derivative character, end quote. Kosick. In other words, the critique seeks to disclose them as derivative and mediated phenomena of social praxis. Dialectical reason does not strive to explicate one economic phenomena with reference to another, but to comprehend each phenomena as a form or mode of existence of the actual relations of life. Open Marxists argue that the critique of political economy amounts to, quote, a critique of ontological conceptions of economic categories, end quote. Bonefeld. Open Marxists raise questions about the foundations of economic forms and view the critique of political economy as the theory of the social constitution of economic categories and of conceptualized human social practice. In their attempt to recover the subversive character of Marx's critique of political economy, open Marxist thinkers focused on a critique of definite social relations, expressed as a relationship between economic things, with a view to revealing the social origin of a topsy-turvy world. Economics studies economic phenomena as ahistorical entities which are devoid of social relations and their social genesis. In grasping the social world as it does, economics impoverishes and distorts the social world because of its one-sided approach, as it reduced social life to quantitative relations, calculation of numbers, mathematical models, and statistics. The failure of institutional and worldview Marxism to, quote, break with bourgeois social theory, end quote, and, quote, particularly in relation to the political economy of capitalism, end quote, Hugo Radis, led to an economic reductionist thinking. The diversity and variety of social phenomena and the richness, contradictions, and dynamic character of social reality were explicated by their reduction to eternal and immutable economic factors, to rigid principles of the bourgeois political economy, and to abstract and general economic laws. Consequently, by and large, orthodox Marxists failed to grasp the social constitution of economic phenomena and to make sense of their genesis, movement, and qualitative phases of development. Their social origins were overlooked, and economic relations and facts were treated as purely technical relations that were related to each other in an external and causal manner. The primacy of economics was absolutized and instrumentalized, and its social content was mystified. The capitalist economic categories were assumed to be natural and unchanged, and therefore The capitalist economic categories were hypostatized and their social validity and genesis were neglected and left unexamined. Quote, economic theory is the theory of a society unaware of itself, end quote. Bonafelt. For open Marxism, social theory is critical when social theory recognizes society's social constitution, and when it begins its investigation of society from within in that society's mode of subsistence, and from a standpoint of struggle and contradiction. The crux of the critique of political economy is not the mere description of the existing economic phenomena, concepts, and categories, but the analysis of their genesis. This genetic explanation seeks to provide a qualitative understanding of economic categories as an inversion of capitalistically organized social relations. In doing so, it shows that the presumed autonomy and primacy of economics in capitalist society is a, quote, autonomy of reified social relations, end quote, and is consequently, quote, related only to one particular historical form of economics, end quote. Kozik. Economics focuses on appearance and outward characteristics, prioritizes the cost-benefit analysis, appears as a science of statistics and economic numbers, and uses mathematics to describe economic phenomena, that is, which it construes as measurable physical quantities and a system of immutable and repetitive regularities and economic laws. Economics is understood exclusively in a quantitative sense. A theological and rather magical interpretation is given as the cause of economic phenomena that draw their point of reference from Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand and the function of market forces. The social origin of economics disappear, and economic issues are treated as technical and quantitative issues that are both primary and of the utmost importance. In a similar vein, one of the main theoretical and political practical problems with institutional Marxism's account of economics is that institutional Marxism assumed that economics was something set, fixed, and prearranged, something to be taken for granted. Economics was taken as something given, immutable, and not reducible to social relations. The preponderance of the economy was perceived as a process of natural history and development, and economics was proclaimed as the definitive, most decisive, the primary original source of all other phenomena and aspects of social life. The social nature of economics was left unquestioned and fetishized because it was transformed into a, quote, result, a thing, an autonomous historical factor, end quote. Kozik. Economics, argued Kozik, is the, quote, component of the fetishized social being which has achieved autonomy and indeed supremacy over the powerless, disintegrated man, atomized in the capitalist society, end quote. Kozik. Hence, for open Marxism, the main focus of a liberating and revolutionary alternative project must be to emancipate, quote, people from the quantitative domination of economic activity, end quote, signifying thus the, quote, emancipation of society from the primacy of economics, end quote. In line with Alfred Schmidt's point that critical theory must have as its objective to contribute to the, quote, breaking up of the primacy of the economy, end quote. Schmidt. Kozik's defiant assertion that, quote, poetry is not a reality of a lower order that is economics, end quote, was not only meant as a challenge to the vulgar economism, calculating thinking, and dogmatism of the Leninist-Stalinist party and state apparatus. It was also intended to highlight that one of the major tasks of open Marxism's critical theory was to, quote, ask the primary question about the origin of economics itself, end quote, and by extension to penetrate to the, quote, roots of social reality, end quote, and disclose, quote, man as the objective subject, end quote. That is, man as the, quote, being that forms social reality, end quote. Kozik. In this respect, economics, politics, culture, and art are revealed as creations, as derived and reified forms of human praxis, as products of the social individuals in their social relations. Based on these premises, according to Clark, Marx's critique of political economy, quote, does not create a space for a Marxist political economy, since political economy can never do more than describe the alienated forms of social existence, end quote. Clark. Open Marxists argued against traditional Marxist theories that proposed the notion of a, quote, Marxist economics and conceived of economic categories such as value, price, crisis, and so on, as closed categories and having an objective validity, which exist independently of the antagonistic social relations and class struggle. They maintain that a purely logical exposition of economic categories dismisses the relationship between capital and labor and isolates class antagonism from a critique of political economy. In the 20th century, the traditional institutional variants of Marxism considered Marx to be a great economist and a founder of a new socialist economic science which was superior and more advanced than the bourgeois political economy. Thus, they completely overlooked man's understanding of bourgeois political economy as the, quote, science of the dominant social order, end quote, and entirely inverted Marx's critical theory, the main purpose of which was the, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, in order to, quote, destroy delusions, to tear apart the deceptive veil of an ideology that justifies the exploitation of man by man, end quote, and at the same time to, quote, destroy a science that, while giving the appearance of objectivity, was actually the science of the means of obtaining wealth by producing poverty, end quote. Rebel. Economics, as Bonafelt pointed out, is the, quote, formula of the false world of, quote, silent compulsion, end quote, that places the satisfaction of human needs under economic duress, end quote. Bonafelt. Marx's main contribution was the development of a critical undertaking which amounts to a, quote, critical explication of economic categories, end quote, and a, quote, critique of economics, end quote, in order to destroy, quote, the historical basis of academic economics, end quote. Backhaus. What is missing in the orthodox Marxist views as far as the existence of a, quote, Marxist economic theory, end quote, or, quote, Marxist political economy, end quote, with its own structure and its economic tenets is concerned, is an understanding that the term, quote, Marxist political economy, end quote, is, quote, a contradiction in terms, since Marx always referred to this work as a, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, end quote. Clark. In the same vein, Kosick argued vigorously that Marx's Capital is not a book that offers a new economic theory, but a critique of economics, a, quote, theoretical critique, or a critical theory of capital, end quote. Kosick. As Kosick put it succinctly, quote, Marx's theory is a critique of economics in the proper sense of the word. Marx's theory exhibits the real movement of economic categories as a reified form of the social movement of people. The real movement of economic categories as a reified form of the social movement of people, end quote. Kosick. The Marxian critical theory rejected the idea of the science of economics. Economic nature is a social nature, and the economic categories are social categories. By seeking, quote, the actual content of the economy itself, end quote, and making an analysis of the origins of capitalist production, one can ascertain that this mode of production is not a, quote, natural one, but a, quote, specific historical form of existence that man has given himself, end quote. As a result, quote, once this content comes to the fore, economic theory would turn into a critical theory, end quote. Open Marxists raised questions about the foundations of economic forms and view the critique of political economy as critical social theory, as a theory of the social constitution of economic categories and of conceptualized human social practice. Open Marxism's recovery of the subversive character of Marx's critique of political economy focused on a critique of definite social relations, expressed as a relationship between economic things, with the objective of revealing the social origin of a topsy-turvy world. Therefore, it is the, quote, social relations themselves, not their labor economy, that require revolutionizing for the sake of a society, end quote, that Marx calls communism. In this sense, open Marxism argued that Marx's critique of political economy is both a, quote, critique of the capitalist social relations and an argument for the classless society, end quote. Bonafelt. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. Chapter 4 of Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment by Christos Memos. Chapter 5 is titled A Critical Theory of Class, Labor, and Economics. Thank you so much for listening.